Hello, hello.
How's it going?
Great. Thank you for joining. So I have a little quote that's by you. I hope it's open source. You wrote in your description of the talk, and your talk is about documentation. Teams often change. People leave and people join. In addition to those changes, we tend to forget that what we were thinking. That's why it's good practice to document those thoughts, discussions, and decisions into a format that doesn't lose them. So I guess we're going to learn something more about those contemporary formats of documenting, so that we don't lose those thoughts. And I'm very much looking forward to what you're going to be sharing now. And I'll see you in a bit.
Awesome.
The scene is.
Alright, hello everybody. I'm Juha, calling in from Helsinki, Finland. It's super nice to be part of the Django Day event. I was really hoping to be there in person, but life happens, and I guess we have to do the best with what we got. So instead I'm gonna join from Helsinki, and when the world is a little bit less, I'll definitely come visit and hopefully we can get some drinks together. So today we're gonna talk about documentation. And Franca that I'm gonna use comes from the Git ecosystem. But if you're using something similar but different, I hope you can kind of get the mental idea of these tools and match that into what you already use. So today we're gonna talk about the commit messages, or something similar, something where you track down the kind of context and history of individual changes. We're gonna talk about the code review, whatever way you happen to use it, whether it's GitHub and pull requests, or whether it's using email notes and batch files. But I hope that many of you are doing some kind of code review in your teams. And then last, we're gonna talk about stories, tasks, tickets, bug reports, whatever you call them. I affectionately call them Jira tickets, because I've been working with Jira quite a lot lately. And the idea is that these are the things that a lot of developers use these days. And by using them a little bit differently, and more importantly, expanding the way we use them, we can capture the moment in history and help the future us be better at what we do. Documentation, however, is not easy. And I think there's a couple of reasons why it's not easy for us as engineers. I think the first reason is that we aren't taught documentation. It's been a while since I've been studying, but at least during my time, we didn't have a course on documentation. We had to kind of write a report on some of the things we did, but that was more of an academic writing exercise than actual software documentation. Instead, we are trained to write for the computers to understand. So it can be challenging to write for other people. And the second reason it's difficult is that as human beings, especially in the era of constant connection, social media, we are not very good with delayed gratification. And with documentation, the thing is that the gratification might never come to the person who wrote the documentation. It might be that you're out of the company before that piece of documentation is ever needed. So we need to kind of motivate ourselves some other way than getting the instant gratification and the hit of dopamine when we write documentation. And that's why I'm not advising you to completely change everything you do. Don't go into the history and try to change your commit messages and pull requests. And don't try to do everything at once. If you take one idea from today and improve that in your day-to-day with like 10% or even 1%, over time that change will grow and it will save you time. Alright, let's get into the meat of the talk. Let's start from commit messages. I personally use a lot of Git. I've been using Git all my professional life. And writing commit messages is something that, once again, never was actually taught to me. It's something I learned by doing, and especially learned by reading other people commit messages. And whenever I talk about commit messages, I need to show this classic comic by the XKCD, because this is such a good representation, and I'm the first one to admit I'm guilty of this as well. When we start working on something, whether it's the start of the project, start of the week, start of the day, start of a feature, it's easier to have the energy to be pedantic and to write good commit messages and think about how to tell what I'm doing. But as time goes on, we get tired. Maybe there's pressure from your team. Maybe there's a deadline. Maybe there's a product owner who discussions I had with my colleague this week on Monday. So write it down immediately after. Not at the end of the day, not at the end of the week, but right after you had those discussions. And code review is a great place to ask a lot of questions. It's not a one-way street where you submit something to somebody else to judge and review, but it's a two-way street. You can drive the code review and the discussion as well as an author. And once you have made some comments and you end up making changes, don't delete those comments. Keep the history, because often we make decisions not to do something, and knowing that is valuable, but it's not something we usually write down. And then the third part is stories, tasks, tickets, whatever you use to record what you need to do beforehand. One of the things I often recommend writing down is the origin and the business driver of a particular change. Why is it important to make this change? Because the situation might change, and in the future, if you need to change something in the code and you don't know why it was made originally, it can cause a lot of problem because it might break something that's undocumented. Especially for bugs, this comes in the form of how to reproduce the bug. Accompanied with tests, that's a great way to make sure that we don't introduce it again. Having some sort of definition of done, because things change gradually, little by little, part by part. So it's valuable to know when this particular ticket was done. Just like code review, this is a great place to ask a lot of questions. You can ask questions from the business people, your teammates, the end users, whoever is relevant to that piece of code and that piece of functionality. Because they are the people who you often know best what they actually need and what they actually want. And the thing with these discussions is that these are often had somewhere outside the platform. I haven't seen a lot of places where the business people would write comments on Jira or the GitHub issues. So you often end up having these discussions over a meeting or casually on the hallway. Write it down. All the questions and the answers need to be documented, or otherwise they're lost knowledge. Because in 2 years, you're not gonna remember those discussions, and you probably won't be in that project anymore. So write the things down. That's kind of how documentation works in general. I want to show a quick example of kind of the workflow from the other side. When you have some documentation, this is what I do when I start working on a bug fix or a new feature. And the example is really simplified, so don't look too much into the content of it, but I just want to show you, maybe give you ideas of how this kind of documentation can be valuable. Let's say I need to change something in this Python file, and I find this some method which looks a little bit funny. This is not what I was taught in elementary school, how to do math. But I need to change this because there's some new requirements. What I then do is that I use git blame. And this is these days and you probably won't be there. Thanks for having me. I will be happy to take some questions. I will also be available on Julep today to hear about your ideas, your thoughts about this kind of thing. And I'm looking forward for the next talks as well.
Thank you so much, Juha. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. We have a question from the internet, and I'm going to read it out. It's a question from Peter on Zulip. He asks, in our team, we always write it down. And he's saying that with a big smiley. So
that's really good. That's the first step.
Both during code review and also for issues, tasks, bugs, etc. But we often run into difficulty to find things later. Like we remember discussing something many months ago, but the relevant issues / merge requests, etc. are long closed and filed away. The tools don't seem to offer a good way to locate past information / discussions. Do you have any experience with that or any suggestions?
Yeah, so the first thing for that is the kind of workflow that I showed. It's not especially good for kind of searching with a certain text, but sometimes it can help you if your starting point is the code. Other than that, like, it's a really nasty issue that we have as kind of the world, is that finding knowledge from the knowledge bases that we have, whether it's these kind of things that I talked today, whether it's intranet, it's still a really difficult challenge. And I don't have like a silver bullet, but one thing that I'm quite excited about is the work that companies are doing to bring different kind of machine learning tools to help find information from this kind of like unstructured data. It's something that some of my colleagues are doing really cool things inside the company, helping us find the kind of hidden information, especially the type of things that we don't even know that we wrote down, in a way, finding connections between things and so on. I do feel that, for example, GitHub has quite good tools for searching things. It's not perfect, and the difficulty, of course, is that if you use different tools for different things, you don't have like a single place to search. But one thing that I recommend is maintaining good links between things. So, in your pull requests, you should always link to the ticket that it solves, because then it's enough to find one piece of the puzzle, and you can follow the links different directions to find the rest of it.
So when
I hope that kind of answered something.
Yeah, it's very valuable. Like when you have a lot of different places for information, and you cannot remember by heart where something went. Make use of the crosslinks as much as possible. Let's see. I have a question from myself. I'm wondering, when writing it down, if I can become better at writing it down, not just for the benefit of others and future and so on, but actually immediately to benefit from it by incorporating this in my own understanding of the problem and the solution, if that's also an aspect of these three branches.
I think it definitely is. All the writing we do helps us become better at writing, but it also helps us understand things, like you said. Like, I think that teaching is the best way to learn, because when you tell somebody else something, or when you write it down, you have to think about it from a little bit different angles. You think about things a little bit differently than you write. So it kind of forces you to think things from different perspectives. And that's always helpful for making sure that you understand it better. And you also remember it better. So, definitely yes.
write it down. I hope this echoes around to a lot of people, both people building stuff at companies for their colleagues, but certainly also those building reusable software who may never be in touch with the others that have to understand their decisions.
And it's definitely something that kind of also needs the drive from the business side. In a way that like we need to understand as companies the value of documentation. It's unfortunately often seen as kind of wasted time because it's difficult to measure the costs of not documenting, especially because it happens later. So I hope that it's also inspiring that those people can decide how to use the time in your software projects.
Thank you so much for joining, Juris.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll be in touch on Sulip, writing things down, writing questions down for you maybe. Let's give a big hand for Juris.